Hello, today we're going to look at how to do comparison questions. Now, comparison questions ask you to compare two different sources. So you've got to either find points of agreement or disagreement between the first source and the second source. There are two comparison questions in the final exam and each one is worth 4 marks. So overall comparison questions are worth 8 marks. In the exam there'll be one question where the sources agree and one question where the sources disagree. So if you've done the first one and you're sure it's an agree one, then you know for a fact that the second one is going to be a disagree one. So when answering the comparison questions, start off by making an overall comparison and use the question to answer it. So sources A and B agree about or sources A and B disagree about. Then you identify a point of comparison and summarise it in your own words. So sources A and B agree or sources A and B disagree. Then quote from both sources and state whether they agree or disagree. So source A says blah 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 blah. Source B agrees or source B disagrees as it says blah 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 blah. And then repeat steps 2 and 3 for another point of comparison. Remember that you must compare the sources by using the words agree or disagree, otherwise you don't gain any marks. So if you don't use those key terms, then you're not going to get any marks for this, so make sure you're using those words. So the overall comparison is for simply stating whether the sources agree or disagree overall. So as I've said already, in the exam, one question will be an agree and the other one will be a disagree question. To gain this mark, you just use the wording of the question and state whether the sources agree or disagree. So if the question was, compare the views of sources A and B on the methods used by abolitionists, your answer is either going to be sources A and B agree on the methods used by abolitionists or sources A and B disagree on the methods used by abolitionists. And if you do that, you get an overall comparison mark. Very straightforward. The developed comparisons are slightly more complex but still pretty simple. So you gain a mark by finding a point in one source that either agrees or disagrees with a point in the second source. So you quote from both sources and you state whether they agree or disagree, and then you develop this point by putting the comparison into your own words. So by finding two sources and comparing them, you get a mark, and then by putting the comparison in your own words, you get a second mark. So obviously if you do this twice plus your overall comparison, then that gives you 5 marks. But it's good to do all 5 because the developed comparisons are going to guarantee you to get the 4 marks, and then the overall comparison is just a little simple thing you have to do at the end. It's very straightforward. It can make sure that if you've maybe missed up one of the points, you're definitely going to get full marks here. So a developed comparison example is sources A and B agree that abolitionists used petitions to help their campaign. Source A states petitions were used by abolitionists to demonstrate the strength of feeling in the country. And source B agrees, remember that keyword agrees, as it states a large number of signatures on petitions prove that abolitionist campaign was popular. So you can see that sources A and B agree is putting that abolitionists use petitions to help their campaign is putting the comparison into your own words and then comparing the two quotes. So the first bit gets you a mark and then comparing the two quotes gets you a mark. Remember, you've got to use the words agree or disagree in your comparisons in order to gain marks. If you haven't used these keywords, you will not get any marks. Now, I've said that about 4 or 5 times now, but every single time someone will forget and they will, by missing out using the word agree or disagree, but have done everything else perfectly, they won't get any marks. So you've got to use those words. Please remember to use them. Okay, so here is a model answer of one of these questions. So got source A and B are about the conditions on slave ships. Source A says the first thing you noticed about slave ships was the smell. It was awful and sickening odour. The areas where slaves were kept were extremely cramped, with hundreds of slaves crammed into a space fit only for 10 or 20. Many slave ship captains had spent time in the Royal Navy prior to becoming involved in the triangular trade. The punishments given out to slaves were similar to those in the Navy, as whippings and the use of thumbscrews were common. Source B says the hold where slaves were forced to spend the journey was a small space in no way suited to the large numbers who spent the journey there. Slaves were harshly punished for any attempts at resistance. Many slaves had their thumbs crushed or were whipped with the cat o' nine tails. Slave ships had a particularly awful odour due to the mix of sweat, death and bodily waste. There were a large number of sailors on slave ships from Liverpool and the surrounding areas. Now, when comparing these things, the best way to do it is to look for key words or terms that overlap between the two sources. So we can see there's lots of words that overlap there. So you can see, for example, the word odor is in both, so that's obviously a comparison. That there are the word punish and punishments in both, and that the word cramped and space is in both. So obviously that means there's 3 comparisons, and that's true. There's 3 comparisons in all of them. You only have to find 2 to be able to get full marks, but there's going to be 3 comparisons in all of the comparison sources, whether they will either agree or disagree. So in order to get full marks, I've written out a model answer, and the model answer is, start off the overall comparison. Both sources agree about the conditions on slave ships. So it's nice and straightforward. They do agree because they've got a lot of overlap. You're just using the question, which is asking you to compare the sources on the conditions of slave ships, and so I'm just getting they agree on the condition of slave ships. That is a mark. Then our first developed comparison, both sources agree that the smell on slave ships was appalling, so we get a mark for that because it's comparing a specific point. And then we get a second mark for using sources. Source A says, the first thing you noticed about slave ships was the smell. It was an awful and sickening odour. Source B agrees, as it says slave ships had a particularly awful odour due to the mix of sweat, death and bodily waste. And then our second developed comparison, sources A and B also agree that the slave ships did not have enough space for the slaves. So again, we've said agree, and we've put a comparison into our own words, so we get a mark. And then source A says that the areas where slaves were kept were extremely cramped, with hundreds of slaves crammed into a space fit only for 10 or 20. Source B agrees, as it says the hold where slaves were forced to spend the journey was a small space in no way suited to the large numbers who spent the journey there. So you can see that there are 5 marks there, and there are 5 marks there because there are 5 times that we've used the word agree. So you can see right at the top in the overall comparison we said agree, and then twice in the first developed comparison and twice in the second developed comparison. So make sure when you're doing these that we're using the words agree or disagree, and you will be very likely to get the marks.